what's that thing over there? It is a most useful linguistic tool, and yet most casually used, at times denoting intellectual carelessness or laziness, a generic superficiality. The thing is simultaneously a word that can evoke fullness and emptiness, presence and absence. It is at the same time a concept that has been often employed to draw a separation between the organic and the inorganic, and to distinguish between the human and the non-human, and people and animals. In this context, it is interesting and instructive to note that in the common parlance, an infant can also be referred to as a thing. She is usually a beautiful thing, but a thing nonetheless, as if the mere supposition that an infant's lack of the self-consciousness and subjectivity predicated on the production of discourse reduces him or her to the sphere of thingness. So I'm talking about language and the lack of self, reflexiveness. It is as if the thing is understood, at least conventionally, as that which lacks self-expression, and whose experience, therefore, remains unsayable by the thing itself. Its experience, be it an infant, an animal, a plant, or a minimal, can certainly be represented, but only through the mediation of human textuality. If we follow this conceptualization to its logical conclusion, we could state that one of the characteristics typical of the thing is that it doesn't have language. A language that is capable of symbolic and imaginative production. So the thing is external to the person and yet often in a relation to it. Let's take, for instance, a tool, a garment, an object, an animal. A thing is ambiguous, while the thing is inherently sublime, resplendent with a sense of mystery and secrecy that cannot be fully comprehended. To recapitulate, the thing is available to us as the endiest of words and the least negotiable of concepts. As a word, it can be everything and nothing. As a concept, it is the center of an ontological discourse that still compels and baffles us. The thing is also the word that, more than others, links the abstractness of language with the tangibility of the world, bridging the gap between representation and reality, symbols and images. As such, it occupies a threshold and a space in between presence and absence, imagination and productivity. It is not surprising, therefore, that the thing and thingness have been at the center of philosophical and artistic discourse, shaping and informing the work of seminal thinkers, and here I'm talking about Jacques Lacan and Martin Heidegger. So now I'm moving to Martin Heidegger and Jacques Lacan to just give you a sense of what they say about thing and thingness. So both Heidegger and Lacan have written explicitly and implicitly about the thing, devoting essays or entire sections of some of their books to discussing the philosophical, psychoanalytical, aesthetic, and ethical implication of thingness. In the thing, das Ding, that's the way in which Heidegger referred in German to the thing. So Heidegger has got an essay on this particular concept, das Ding. An essay first delivered in form of a lecture at the Bayerischen Akademie der Schönen Künste on the 6th of June 1950, and later collected in the volume Vorträge und Aufsätze 1936-1953, and translated into English in 1971. The German philosopher, so this is an essay, and the title of the essay is that thing. The German philosopher pursues his investigation of the being, and he actually makes quite an important and considerate effort to write it with a capital B. So the being of being, which already present in his most famous work, Being and Time, continues to occupy him throughout his life, although with different tonalities. The thing, for instance, is close to the preoccupation that one also finds in the origin of the work of art, and to Heidegger's philosophical reading of poetry and language in general in the book On the Way to Language. And it's precisely in the book On the Way to Language that Heidegger articulates and discusses the notion of Verzicht, renunciation. We need to learn to renounce representation, to renounce this kind of modes, habitual modes of dealing with the outside. In these writings, Heidegger articulates a relation between forms, especially in the shape of works of art or even simple objects, and their inspiration, or in other words, the things that initiated the actual process of production. In Heidegger, the original kernel of the work, that which brought about the becoming of the work itself, where does the work originate from? How? Why do we start creating? It's the attempt to go back to the notion of the beginning. What is it that pushes us to do something, to do things? So in Heidegger, the original kernel of the work, that which brought about the becoming of the work itself, remains undisclosed, not so much because of a metaphysical secrecy or a linguistic inadequacy to say it, but rather as a consequence of an inherent separateness that cannot be subsumed by the work. Let us take, for instance, the famous example of the jug in the essay The Thing. An example, by the way, that Lacan will refer to in his discussion of la chose. That's what Lacan calls it. So the modeling of the jug, this is the example that Heidegger provides us to exemplify his articulation of the thing. The modeling of the jug, imagine a jug and the work of the potter. That is, its construction into a form takes place from nothing, but more importantly, retains the nothing from which it is produced by encasing it within itself. The jug is empty. The jug as a finished object is empty. And yet it is precisely this emptiness that for Heidegger is at the core of jug's very existence and usefulness, in that to be of use the jug must be emptied in order to be filled, emptied and filled again, and so on. The jug as object, which is predicated on its ability to be used, is designed on a thing whose center is a void. And I would like to quote a passage from Heidegger. That's what Heidegger says, or writes. Sides and bottom, of which the jug consists and by which it stands, are not really what does the holding. But if the holding is done by the jug's void, then the potter, who forms sides and bottom on his wheel, doesn't, strictly speaking, make the jug. He only shapes the clay. No, he shapes the void. So there is these relations with the void, with the origin, with the thing. This image becomes for Heidegger a kind of metaphor for poetry and art, insofar as poetry, as Heidegger will attempt to demonstrate in his essay Word, in On the Way to Language, is characterized by a language which must be aware and determined to protect the other from itself. There is the void, which, although present within the language of poetry, remains unsable by it. So there is this, this kind of drive is there, and yet cannot be represented. Poetry itself is a jug made of language, at the center of which lies a void that poetry, in order to be successful poetry, must not fill. Poetic language, according to Heidegger, must learn to renounce the desire to say and express the void within it and simply live with it. This, as Agamben writes in the Camden Community, is the experience of the non-linguistic in language. So the existence of the non-linguistic in language. It is, in other words, the presence of an extra-linguistic thing, which I would call the thing as such, which, although necessary to the work of art and in a constant relation to it, remember that the work of art couldn't exist without it, is always already external to it. We could call it an excess that defies representation, and it's parallel to it. Lacan writes that the thing is at the center of the work of art, yet external to it. C'est que nous décrivons comme ce lieu central, cette extériorité intime, cette extimité qui est la chose. What we described as the central place, as the intimate exteriority or extimacy, that is the thing. It is that which propels art and makes art possible by remaining utterly other from art. So there is a very interesting tension and a dynamic between the other and art, the self and the other. They are in mutual kind of relation, and yet there is no possibility of subsuming the other, of absorbing it, of cannibalizing it. There is no possibility of integrating completely within our language. It will remain another, within us though. And that's, I think, it's very important for us to come to terms with this philosophical concept, because it can help us negotiate all sorts of issues in relation to what we have been discussing throughout yesterday: hospitality, the condition of globalization, of cosmopolitanism. Although Lacan's interrogation of the thing originates from psychoanalytic concerns, and there are very distinct interests. On the one hand, you have Heidegger, who is very much interested in an ontological project, debunking the metaphysical tradition, getting back to the truth of the being of being, capturing the essence of this otherness, which is also ourselves. In Lacan, the interest is different. He's interested in unpacking psychoanalytical issues with the self. And yet there are some interesting similarities. So, although Lacan's interrogation of the thing originates from psychoanalytic concern, especially Freud's articulation of das Ding, the conclusions he arrives at are instructively similar to those reached by Heidegger. So there is a kind of fil rouge, if you want, characterizing 20th century discourse in relation to the thing. And by the way, I have to say that there is a return of interest to the thing, apart from Heidegger and Lacan, who are seminal thinkers in 20th century discourse, critical theory. But think of the American theorist Bill Brown, who in 2000 or 2001 dedicated a whole issues of critical inquiry to the theory of thingness.